Story 1. My phone lit up with an alert as I stood at my front door. An unknown tracker was moving with me. The notification stayed on the screen and vibrated again before I processed it. I stepped away from the porch light and into the darker edge of the driveway so my face would not be visible from the street. My hands were already shaking when I opened my purse. I dumped everything onto the concrete without thinking. Wallet, keys, makeup, receipts. My fingers brushed something smooth and cold that did not belong to me. I pulled out a small white disc and stared at it. An Airtag. I lifted my head slowly and scanned the street. No pedestrians. No doors open. No engines revving. Just quiet houses and pale streetlights reflecting off thin snow along the curb. I dropped the device onto the ground and crushed it under my heel. The plastic cracked loudly in the silence. I kept stomping until the casing split, and a small metallic piece snapped free and skidded across the driveway. I stepped back and listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No sudden engine start. I gathered my things quickly and ran to the back door. My hand slipped twice before I got the key in. I went inside, locked it, then locked it again. I stood in the dark kitchen without turning on lights. The refrigerator hummed. Pipes ticked softly in the walls. That was it. I moved upstairs slowly, keeping everything dark. I did not want the house glowing like a target. From my bedroom window, I could see the entire street. 5 minutes passed. Then headlights appeared at the end of the block. An older sedan, dull paint. It rolled slowly past my house, too slowly. The engine tone was low and steady. It did not stop. It continued down the street and disappeared at the corner. I stayed crouched below the window. 2 minutes later, the same headlights returned from the opposite direction, slower this time. The driver's window was halfway down. I dropped flat against the floor. The car passed again. Tires crunched lightly against the thin line of snow near the curb. It came back a third time and stopped directly across from my driveway. The engine idled. I did not move. The headlights shut off, but the engine remained running. Seconds stretched. The driver's door opened. I heard the dull metal shift. A soft close. Then footsteps. Slow. Measured. Gravel shifted under weight. The steps stopped near the edge of my driveway. I pressed my hand over my mouth to control my breathing. Another step. Closer. My pulse thudded so hard it made my ears ring. The footsteps stopped completely. I heard breathing outside. Faint. Controlled. A shadow passed across the lower part of the window. I stayed still. The shadow shifted slightly, as if leaning closer to the glass. I could hear fabric moving. Then, the breathing stopped. The footsteps retreated slowly. The car door shut. The engine revved slightly and the sedan rolled forward. It did not speed off. It moved down the street at the same slow pace and disappeared past the corner. I waited nearly 30 minutes before lifting myself high enough to see over the window frame. The street looked empty again. I did not sleep. Every sound felt amplified. The heater clicking on. Wood settling in the walls. At one point I heard a faint crunch near the side yard. I froze. It did not repeat. Around 4 in the morning I went downstairs and stood in the dark living room, staring through the blinds. The broken pieces of the Airtag were gone. The sidewalk where I crushed it was clean. I did not step outside. At sunrise, I unlocked the door carefully and stepped onto the porch. The air was sharp and still. I scanned the street. No cars. I looked down at the driveway. Nothing remained from the device. Near the curb, there were fresh shoe prints leading from the road toward my driveway. Larger than mine. deep impressions showing full weight. They stopped halfway up the driveway and turned back toward where the car had been parked. I followed them only with my eyes. I went back inside and locked the door. Around mid-morning, my phone vibrated again. Unknown number, no preview, then another vibration, then another. I turned the screen over slowly. A photo message. I opened it. The image was grainy and taken from across the street. My house. My porch. Time stamped 12 minutes before the first alert last night. Another message came immediately. You should not have broken it. Another message followed. You were asleep in the car. My throat tightened. Another image arrived. A low-angle shot from beneath a vehicle. My vehicle. The driveway visible beyond the tire. Time-stamped from the previous night. The message below read, I am still close. My hands felt numb. I did not go outside. I backed away from the door and locked it again, even though it was already locked. Minutes passed. My phone vibrated again. Snow is starting again. I walked slowly to the window. Fine flakes were drifting down. Another message appeared. I can see the porch from here. I stood motionless in the center of my living room. I did not respond. 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated again. Same street. Tonight. I stared at the end of the block. Headlights turned on in the distance. They stayed on. They did not move. After several minutes, the lights shut off. I stayed awake all day. When night returned, I did not turn on any lights. Around 11, my phone vibrated again. A new image. My driveway. Fresh snow falling. Taken moments earlier. Then another. A closer shot of my front door. Then another. A zoomed image of my upstairs window. The message under it read, I know which room. My breathing became shallow. I stayed on the floor away from the windows. I did not check outside again. Around midnight, I heard a faint crunch in the driveway. Slow steps, gravel shifting under boots. The porch boards creaked once under weight. The door handle moved slowly downward and held. It did not rattle. It did not force. Just pressure. Then release. 3 soft knocks followed. Evenly spaced. I did not move. The footsteps moved along the side of the house. I heard snow compress under steady steps. They stopped beneath my bedroom window. Silence. Then a soft tap against the glass. Not loud, not frantic, just enough to confirm presence. My phone vibrated again in my hand. I did not look at it. The tap came again. Then the steps retreated toward the driveway. The engine started across the street. Headlights flashed briefly through the blinds and then went dark again. My phone vibrated once more. The final message read, Next time, do not break it. I stayed on the floor until dawn. When the sun rose, I forced myself to look outside. Fresh snow covered everything. No visible tracks in the driveway. But in the middle of the street, directly across from my house, the snow was disturbed, in a rectangular shape consistent with a car that had been parked there for hours. My phone vibrated again. A final image appeared. Taken from inside a vehicle, through a windshield. My house centered in the frame. The timestamp was from 10 minutes earlier. The message under it read, I am still here. Story 2. I heard my front door close, and I knew it was wrong because I never heard the deadbolt slide. I opened my eyes in the dark and focused on the shape near the closet. It was a person standing still. I could hear fabric move slightly. I did not move. I kept my breathing steady. A slow step crossed the floorboards. My hand slid under the pillow, where I keep my phone. The screen lit my fingers, but I kept it angled down. No alerts, no calls. Another step, closer to the bed. I turned my face toward the wall. so the light would not reflect in my eyes. The figure stopped. I heard a small metallic sound, like something being placed carefully on wood. The shape shifted. I saw a dark sleeve, loose fabric, a hood covering the head. The air carried a faint smell of stale smoke from clothing. I sat up fast and shouted and swung my legs off the bed. The figure moved immediately. He ran toward the hallway. I saw him clearly for a second in the streetlight coming through the window. Black hoodie, faded leather jacket with stains. His jaw was tight. He did not hesitate. Something clattered behind him. A sharp metal sound against hardwood. I followed into the hallway, but stopped at the front door. It was open. Cold air came inside. He was already gone. I closed the door and locked the deadbolt. My hands shook, and I missed once before the lock engaged. I stood there listening. No footsteps outside. No engine starting. Nothing. I walked back toward the bedroom. On the carpet near the closet was a kitchen knife from my block. The blade pointed toward the bed. It was placed flat. I picked it up and called emergency. Officers arrived within minutes. They searched the house and the yard. No broken windows, no forced locks, no damage to the door. The deadbolt functioned normally. They asked if I recognized the man. I described the hoodie and jacket. They left after finishing the report. The street went back to empty. I did not sleep. I sat in the living room with lights on and the knife beside me. At sunrise, I checked the locks again. Nothing disturbed. Nothing missing from the house. Later that day, I thought about the man from the bar. Black hoodie, faded leather jacket with stains. He had walked in and stood without sitting. He stared at me while I poured drinks. He ordered a cheap double that we barely serve. He paid with crumpled cash. When I asked for a name to close the tab, he leaned forward and said, "I knew I would find you here, Kevin. My name is not Kevin." I asked how he knew that name. He said it quiet. It sounded normal. "I know what you did." Then he walked toward the elevators and left. That was hours before someone stood in my bedroom. That night I replaced the locks myself. I installed a second deadbolt. I added a wedge under the door and placed a glass on the handle so it would fall if touched. I kept the kitchen lights off and moved through the house without making noise. Around 2 a.m, I heard a faint sound outside. Not a knock, not footsteps, just the slightest scrape near the door. I stayed still. The glass on the handle made a small click as the handle moved downward slowly. The wedge scraped lightly against the floor. The handle returned to its position. Silence followed. My phone screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Kevin, you changed the lock." Another message followed seconds later. "Good. Now I know which house is yours." I did not respond. I did not move. Minutes passed. Then a new message arrived. "Check the back door." I remained seated and did not go to the door. After several minutes, I heard movement near the side of the house. Snow compressing under weight. Slow steps moving toward the back. The back door handle pressed down slowly and held. It released. Another press. Then nothing. I stayed awake until morning. At sunrise, I opened the front door carefully. On the porch boards lay a different kitchen knife. Longer blade, black handle, clean. It was placed with the point facing inward toward the house. Beneath it was a folded receipt from my bar, printed the previous night, for the same cheap double the man had ordered. On the back, written in block letters, was one line: "Tonight, do not scream." I stepped back inside and locked the door again. Around midday, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. A photo message. I opened it. The image showed my driveway from across the street. Timestamp current. Another image followed immediately. Calm. My front door. Then another. A zoomed image of my upstairs window. The next message read, "You left the light on last night." I walked to the window slowly and looked through the smallest gap in the curtain. A dark sedan was parked at the end of the block. Engine off. Windows dark. It did not move. I did not step outside. Evening came. I turned off every light and stayed seated near the hallway with the knife in my hand. Around 11, I heard a car door close softly outside. Then, footsteps. Slow. Even. Moving up the driveway, the porch creaked under weight. The handle turned once, held, released, a second time. Then 3 soft taps, spaced evenly across the door. I did not make a sound. The footsteps moved along the side of the house. Snow shifted under boots. They stopped beneath my bedroom window. A soft knock touched the glass. Not loud, just enough to confirm contact. My phone vibrated again. "I can see you in the hallway." I stayed seated. The knock came again. Then, the footsteps retreated toward the driveway. The engine started across the street. Headlights did not turn on. The vehicle rolled away slowly. I remained in place until daylight. When the sun rose, I opened the door carefully. The knife was gone. The receipt was gone. In their place, taped to the doorframe, was a small square photo. It showed me standing behind the bar 2 nights earlier, pouring a drink, unaware of the camera pointed at me. The timestamp was printed clearly in the corner. On the back of the photo was one sentence. "Kevin is not your name, but it will be." My phone vibrated again before I could step back inside. One final message appeared. "Tonight, I come in quietly." Story 3. The freezer alarm started beeping at 2:14 in the morning while I was alone in the restaurant. The dining room lights were already off, and the chairs were stacked. I was finishing inventory in the back when the alarm cut through the silence again. It is a loud, mechanical sound that means the door is open or the temperature has risen too fast. I walked down the narrow hallway toward the kitchen, and the beeping continued in steady intervals. The walk-in freezer door was closed when I reached it. The heavy handle sat flat against the metal. The alarm kept sounding. I pressed the latch and pulled the door open. Cold air rolled out. The interior light flicked on. Nothing looked disturbed at first glance. Boxes stacked. Meat bins labeled. Floor clean. The alarm continued. I stepped inside and looked toward the control panel mounted on the wall. The temperature reading was normal. I turned to close the door behind me, and that is when I saw the cord. A thin black extension cord ran from behind the shelving unit on the left, across the floor, and disappeared through the rubber seal at the bottom of the freezer door. The seal had been cut just enough to allow the cord to pass through without being obvious from the outside. The cord was plugged into something behind the shelves. I stepped closer and crouched. Behind the stack of boxed fries was a small space that should have been empty. It was not empty. A portable heater was plugged into the extension cord and turned on, its red coil glowing. It was aimed directly at the internal temperature sensor mounted low on the wall. The heater was positioned carefully. It was close enough to warm the sensor without raising the overall freezer temperature immediately. The alarm beeped again. I reached forward and unplugged the heater. The red coil faded. The beeping stopped seconds later. I stayed crouched for a moment, staring at the heater. It did not belong to the restaurant. We do not keep heaters near frozen food. I stood up slowly and looked around the freezer again. Everything else appeared normal. I stepped out into the kitchen and looked down the hallway toward the back exit. The back door was closed. The alarm panel near the office showed no breach. I walked to the door and tested it. Locked. I checked the side entrance by the dumpsters. Locked. I returned to the freezer and stared at the cut in the rubber seal at the bottom of the door. It was clean, straight, deliberate. I pulled the extension cord out and followed it into the hallway. It ran along the wall and disappeared behind the soda machine near the service entrance. I walked around the machine and found the cord plugged into a wall outlet that employees rarely use. The cord was new, not one of ours. I unplugged it and wrapped it around my hand. I walked into the dining area and checked the front entrance. Locked. I was alone in the building. I am always alone on closing shift Sundays. That is why it felt wrong. Someone had to enter after we closed or before we opened earlier in the day. I pulled out my phone and checked the security app. All cameras online. I opened the live feed for the kitchen camera. The image showed the freezer door closed. It showed me standing there. I scrubbed back the timeline to 1 hour earlier. Nothing unusual. 2 hours earlier. Nothing. I scrubbed back further. At 1:36 in the morning, the freezer alarm first activated. I tapped the camera feed for that timestamp. The image froze for a moment and then jumped forward to 1:38. 2 minutes. Missing. I checked another camera angle in the hallway. Same gap. The footage from 1:36 to 1:38 did not exist. I stood in the dining room, listening. The building was quiet, except for the low hum of refrigeration units. I walked back to the kitchen and opened the freezer again. The heater was still on the shelf where I left it. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. No store sticker, no label. The plug was clean. I carried it into the office and set it on the desk. Then I noticed something else. The office door was slightly open. I always close it completely. I stepped inside. The desk drawer, where we keep the spare key to the liquor cabinet, was open. The key was still inside. Nothing appeared stolen. The safe under the desk was locked. I crouched to inspect it and saw faint scratches near the keypad. Not deep, not forced, just contact marks. I stood up slowly. I was not alone earlier. Someone had been inside the building. Someone knew where the freezer sensor was located. Someone knew how to warm it without immediately spoiling product. Someone knew where the cameras were and how to create a gap. My phone vibrated in my hand. Unknown number. No preview. I stared at the screen before opening it. A photo message. I tapped it. The image loaded slowly. It showed the interior of the freezer from an angle behind the shelving unit, the heater visible in the foreground. The timestamp was 1:35 in the morning. 1 minute before the alarm first sounded, another message followed. You walked in faster than I expected. My breathing became shallow. I looked toward the hallway. Nothing moved. Another message came through. Check the second shelf. I walked back to the freezer slowly. I opened the door and stepped inside. I looked at the second shelf from the bottom where we store boxed chicken. At first, nothing stood out. Then I noticed a small gap between two boxes that should have been flush. I pulled one forward. Behind it was a small black device taped to the wall. Not a heater, a small camera. Its lens pointed toward the door. A tiny red light blinked once and then went dark. I reached for it and stopped. My phone vibrated again. Do not touch it. I withdrew my hand. Another message followed. I am still here. I turned slowly in the freezer, scanning the corners, the ceiling, the stacked bins. No movement, no sound, except the hum of the compressor. I stepped out of the freezer and shut the door. The hallway felt narrower than before. I walked toward the back exit and pressed my ear to it. Silence outside. My phone vibrated again. You should not be alone on Sundays. I walked quickly to the dining area and looked out the front windows toward the empty parking lot. My car was the only vehicle there. Streetlights cast long shadows across the asphalt. Another vibration. I can see the office light. I turned my head toward the office. The light was on. I had left it on when I placed the heater on the desk. I walked to the office doorway slowly. The heater was no longer on the desk. The desk was clear. The drawer that had been open was now closed. I stepped inside. The safe keypad scratches were gone. The metal surface was clean. I turned in place. My phone vibrated again. You missed something. I walked back into the kitchen and looked toward the freezer seal at the bottom of the door. The cut in the rubber was gone. The seal was intact. No slit, no cord, no damage. I opened the freezer. The heater was not on the shelf. The camera was not behind the boxes. The shelves were aligned perfectly. Everything appeared normal. My phone vibrated again. Look up. I lifted my head, slowly. Above the freezer door, mounted near the ceiling where the wall meets the corner, was a small dark shape that had not been there before. A camera lens reflecting the fluorescent light. It was angled directly toward the hallway. Another message arrived. Smile. The freezer alarm started beeping again behind me. We've reached the end. Which one felt the most real to you? And if your phone buzzes with a warning tonight, do not ignore it.